Well, as people, we are always in one season of life or another. As I look back on my life, there were my growing up years, my years in Bible school and university, my years as a high school teacher, and then for the biggest part of my my years as a pastor. First as an associate, then as a church planter and lead pastor. And now in this latest iteration of my life, I guess I've been doing all three. Some pastoring, some high school teaching, but most of all, been coaching men and pastors, as well as, of course, doing these podcasts. And as I am now in my 60s, I like to say early 60s, there is one additional thing that I feel that I'm moving towards. As my wife looks at stepping away from her teaching job in the next year or so, we are looking at doing some more traveling, and in particular, me doing some more speaking at various events and contexts, whether it's recovery meetings or men's retreats or conferences, Sunday morning settings, or speaking to leaders. Now, I know that sounds presumptuous, perhaps, but when I started out on this journey of coaching and podcasting a few years ago, I did so on the condition that I would walk through the doors that God opens. I've already been surprised at the doors and relationships that have opened up for me doing these podcasts. Kind of a fun one. For example, I was recently invited to speak at a men's conference in Dallas in 2024. Of course, I hope that coincides with a Cowboy game, but I do have to get my priorities straight. But I've been thinking about that more and wondering what God's going to open up. And towards that goal of traveling some more and speaking at different events, I've always wanted to do a talk looking back on my 30 years of pastoring and drawing some big picture conclusions. Now, you might say, well, what does this have to do with your podcast, Pastoral Recovery, Pastors on Porn, you ask? Well, first of all, I think our lives are holistic. As we learn to navigate the unique challenges of being a pastor in a healthy and holistic way, it can have a tremendous positive role in giving us the momentum towards healthier living. And that momentum, of course, can also help us significantly with walking away from our addictive impulses as well. So here's my version of a talk called 30 Years a Pastor. Reflections from the best years of my life. Well, that title itself is a bit cheeky because you might say, is the title 30 Years a Pastor, is that akin to the movie 12 Years a Slave? It could be that. Or is the title Reflections from the Best Years of My Life, is that saying that being a pastor were the best years of my life? Or is that kind of like a spouse who tells her husband in a fit of anger, I gave you the best years of my life? So I guess after this talk, you can draw your own conclusions. But I have pastored full-time from the ages of approximately 30 to 60. Although, of course, I was doing ministry before that time, and I'm certainly now still doing ministry. But I think you know what I mean by that. Strapped in, full-time, leading a church, pretty much my sole vocational role. And as I look back on those 30 years, I think I've arrived at a few key conclusions that I've learned anyways for me about how to have a proper relationship with myself, a proper relationship with others, and finally, a proper relationship with the concept of success. I sometimes fantasize about taking my perspectives now and somehow going back 30 years in time and then playing out in this fantasy about how I would lead and respond with the lessons or court sense that I carry with me now in my 60s and having the energy of a 30-year-old. But alas, life doesn't work that way. Now, maybe you're a lot younger And so perhaps through this talk, I can do it vicariously through you, as you hopefully can get a head start on some of these lessons by perhaps drawing from some of my ramblings here. So let's start first of all with what 30 years of pastoring taught me about myself. I don't think there's anything quite like the crucible of pastoral ministry to reveal truths about yourself. And in learning about yourself, I would say that there are at least 4 areas that I think would be a tremendous advantage for you to know. To know your brokenness, to know your gifts, to know your limitations, and finally, to know your calling. So, first of all, let's talk about this area of our brokenness. Now, considering the theme of this podcast, it's probably not surprising that I start here. We all enter, and we've all entered pastoral ministry for a lot of reasons. Some good, some not so good, and in all of that, there's a mixture, isn't there? Now, some people even enter into ministry thinking that it will help them overcome their own brokenness or rise above their own brokenness. I've actually even met a few counselors and therapists that would fit that bill as well. But none of us entered ministry without a history, and all of us have some aspect of brokenness on our journey, and it doesn't go away simply because we now wear a collar, whether that's a real collar or a metaphorical collar. For example, let's say you gained 50 to 100 pounds overnight, and then you started walking up a whole set of stairs. You would become so aware of the weight and the strain and stress that put on your ankles, your knees, your hips. All of those joints would feel a new strain because of your extra weight. And I would say in the same way, the weight of ministry, it adds all sorts of strain on those joints in our life, those areas of brokenness that we brought in. Now, I know as leaders, pastors, ministry leaders, we all want to instinctively hide our brokenness and vulnerabilities, thinking that it will protect us in our ministry or our job or our reputation. But here is my promise to you. If you hide, your brokenness will eventually take you out of ministry anyways. Let me say it again. If you hide, your brokenness will eventually take you out of ministry. Now, I didn't say your brokenness. I said your hidden brokenness. Maybe you'll leave because the internal strain, the spiritual dissonance becomes too much for you. Or maybe you'll leave because you become a news story if you're rich and famous, or just a local news story. Or maybe you'll leave and call it burnout. I read the story recently of Darren Patrick, who was a successful pastor who ended up committing suicide. Now, I'm not sure what was all going on there, but he actually had a period of time after his church setting found out about his sexual brokenness that resulted in the loss of his first ministry. And in interviews with him while he was still alive, this was what he said. He said, "I stopped pursuing friendships." Or another way, I stopped being known. And that was the beginning of the end. So, you may as well start by being known. Now, I don't mean being known to everybody in some sort of public therapy session, but I mean finding people who know you and care for you and believe in you despite your brokenness. And here's another crazy idea. Perhaps your brokenness, given to God in His healing, may actually end up being the greatest leverage you have into the lives of the broken people that you pastor. So first of all, to know yourself means to know your brokenness. Here's the second one. Know your gifts. Now, over the years, I tried to imitate things I saw in other pastoral leaders that I looked up to and respected. For example, many of those leaders I looked up to could play guitar. So I tried to play guitar, but my stubby fingers wouldn't cooperate. In many settings, leaders I looked up to could have prophetic words for people or pray for people to, experience healing, and it actually happened. But that never quite worked for me. I could never quite get the Robbie Dawkins or John Wimber thing down and then share this great story about how God worked through me supernaturally in some amazing way. Whether it's not even supernatural, I listen with longing to people who were naturally evangelistic and would lead people to the Lord. And they would share how they did that, whether it was their neighbors or people they lived among, or whether it was through their Sunday preaching. I just never saw it happen through me to any great degree. In terms of, a picture of what a good pastor was, in many ways, I guess I felt like a little bit of, like a 5'5" guy who wanted to play basketball in the NBA. Now, if you have some of those giftings, that's great. I'm just saying I could never get there. And trust me, it wasn't for lack of trying. The biggest thing I learned was my gifting was in the area of being a teacher and a pastor. And it actually meant that I was good at certain things and not so good, or maybe even lousy at other things. While we're on the topic of gifting, you might be one of those who have a combination of pastoring gifts as well as teaching gifts. Apparently that's kind of my personal mix. And every now and again, I'll just say it, I've become quite enamored with something I've said or a talk I've given, and I think, boy, that was really something. And in those times, it's good for me to be reminded of the verse in Corinthians that says, what do you have that God hasn't given you? And if everything you have is from God, why boast as though it were not a gift? Now, if that verse doesn't bring me down to earth, then this thought does. Even Balaam's donkey was given a message from God to speak and the ability to speak it. So, Vern, remember, even in your best moments, you are still a donkey without God. Now, that brings me to my next lesson. To know yourself means to know your limitations. Scripture in Romans tells us this, for by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. Now, I don't believe that we are to sell ourselves short. There's kind of this national Canadian false humility. I really am nothing that comes with our culture. So I don't think we should sell ourselves short like that. What has God said? What has God called me into? But the verse does say that we need to have a realistic and sober estimation of ourselves, including our limitations. Now, do you remember the parable that Jesus told about giving 1 talent or 2 talents or 5 talents? I guess you could even throw in 10 talents to his servants and then going away. Now, we often teach that parable to warn people not to be the 1 talent guy that buries his gifts. But what we usually don't acknowledge is that different people are given differing amounts of talents and abilities. Not everybody has 5 talents or 10 talents. The guy with 2 is celebrated for what? Returning 2 talents. He's not chastised for not returning 5 like the 5-talent guy. Now, it's a lot easier for me to say I'm not as gifted, for example, as, I don't know, an Andy Stanley or a Rick Warren, but it's a lot harder for me to say that to somebody in my local sphere or community or denominational circles. I remember someone asking me, for example, why I wasn't seeing the same results as another pastor they knew. I remember saying to them, well, maybe God gave me 2 talents and he gave that person 5 talents. They didn't really like that answer because they thought I wasn't pushing myself hard enough, I guess. Along those lines, here's a related idea that I think should encourage some good self-reflection. Somebody told me that pastoral ministry would always feel like a wobbly 3-legged stool. There are 3 legs that we need to make use of, but they will never be the same length or same height in our lives. The 3 legs that we needed to have or to use at some level were the ability to be a leader, the ability to communicate or preach, be a stage person, and then the ability to deal with people individually, pastor individually. Some have used that idea in a differing way. They said, the 3 legs are the ability to preach, the ability to organize, and the ability to pastor people individually. The reality is that nobody is equally capable or strong in all 3 legs. For example, there are some amazing people persons who exude such loving care to people, but they couldn't organize themselves out of a wet paper bag. There are some leaders who are amazing at pulling together an organization towards a goal or vision, but they're almost painful to talk to one-on-one. You certainly wouldn't want them visiting you at the hospital. The advice that I was given was to focus on what I do best on, work on improving what I'm okay in, and do your best to compensate through staff or other strategies for what I suck at. I do know this, spending all my time trying to improve my weaknesses is a great recipe for depressing ministry. Some churches even fail to understand this in hiring pastors or leaders. They look for pastors who can do all of them, and when they're disappointed, they pendulum swing back and forth between leaders of different strengths without realizing they're now inviting new weaknesses along with their new pastor. In other words, we need to know ourselves and know our limitations. The next thing we need to know is we need to know our call. Now, I've already said pretty clearly that I became aware and have been quite, it was never a challenge for me to know that I had a pastoral call on my life. I once had a couple of well-known prophetic people go all spiritually gushy over me around this pastoral anointing, good Pentecostal word there, that was on my life. That was affirming, but it simply confirmed something that I really already knew, because way back when I was 19, God spoke to me at a Navigator conference. Yes, God can speak even at a Navigator conference. And he spoke to me this verse, "You did not call me, but I called you and appointed you to go and bear fruit. Fruit that will last." Now, I know when I say I was called into this ministry, I know that doesn't require me to be a vocational pastor. For a number of years, for example, I taught high school and I pastored people in that way. Yet, when I stepped into my role as a vocational pastor, it did seem to bring together all of those previous longings and experiences that had gone before. Having said that, this is something I learned well into my pastoral years that has saved my bacon. Now, for example, we all know that being a pastor is all about pastoring people, right? But here's the truth. I am ultimately not a pastor because I love people. Because frankly, there are times where my love for people ebbed and flowed. Some people are easy to love. Others are more like one pastor called people who are walking paper cuts. As the phrase goes, some people bless us when they come, and others bless us when they go. So here's what saved my bacon was an encounter I had with Scripture in the dialogue between Jesus and Peter. And this is what it says. When they finished eating, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he answered, "you know I love you." Jesus replied, "Feed my lambs." Jesus asked a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," he answered, "you know that I love you." Jesus told him, "Shepherd my sheep." Jesus asked a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was deeply hurt that Jesus had to ask him a third time, "Do you love me?" "Lord, you know all things," he replied. "You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Now, people have said a lot of things about that passage and brought out different things, but here is where this passage became so profound to me on my pastoral journey. I realized that through all my years of pastoring people, my greatest call is to love Jesus. In fact, I am not ultimately in ministry because of my love for people. I am in ministry because of my love for Jesus. And because of that love, I care for and tend the people that he loves as long as they're in my care. Now, I don't know about for you, but for me, that made all the difference in the world. Because talking about people, there's a few things I've learned about working with people. So here we go, lessons about people. Now, let me start with a rather cynical view from my years of ministry. People are fickle. Do you remember the crazy story in the book of Daniel when Nebuchadnezzar was celebrating with all his buddies with the goblets that he'd ripped off from the temple? And suddenly on the wall appears God's hand writing these words, "Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin." Now, among the larger message in God's rebuke to the king was this: you are weighed in the balance and found wanting, not good enough. Now, if God writes that on your wall, that would be a good time, just saying, to fall to your knees and repent. But in ministry, I have found that people are often all too eager to take out their magic markers and write that on your wall. And you will experience over and over again people saying in one way, shape, or form, "You have been weighed in my balance and found wanting, not good enough." Now, first of all, in those times and places, it's always good to go back to that earlier lesson, "Do you love me? Feed my sheep," and remind ourselves that, in people's votes of no confidence, that we still are doing this because of our love for the Lord and our obedience to the Lord. Now, folks, here is the honest truth. Over 30 plus years of ministry, my wife and I have had hundreds and hundreds, it could be thousands, of people who have come to our local church that I and my wife pastored, made it home for a while, then moved on. How do you deal with that? Of course, the natural conclusion is to take that personally. I suck. I'm not enough. I need to try harder to meet their needs. Or if we just had this or that ministry, or we did this or that, they would still be with us. One perspective I have been trying on recently is the idea that our roles as pastors was to care and aid people on their spiritual journey of growth for as long as we had them. Here's an example from our own family and probably your family too. I don't rue the fact that my kids left home. I kind of think that that was the way it's supposed to be. You know, maybe sometimes the only kids that don't leave home are the handicapped kids. Now, I'm not saying that those who stuck in our church for a long period of time were all handicapped, but you get what I'm saying. I'm just saying that every healthy parent knows that our job is to care and raise our kids for a season of their lives and not hold on to them. And as a pastor, I and my wife have acted as parents for many, many people for a period of time. Other times I've acted more like an adoptive parent. Perhaps when people came from other churches, that maybe was more of an adoptive parent role. Maybe at times I even think that I was like a foster parent, where people needed us just for a short time because they were in a difficult place in their lives. But as long as people were under our church, in our church, I do believe my wife and I were safe parents. That was our role, as long as they were with us. And I think God was pleased with that, and still is pleased with that. That kind of brings me to my final lessons I've learned about success. Now, first of all, let me just say, I am a competitive person. I used to have a friend who wanted just to hit the tennis ball with me back and forth without keeping score. And I was thought, well, what's that about? You know, I want to know if I can beat him, or even if I lose to him, am I getting better? I'm also a guy that likes metrics. You know, no sooner did I get to 30,000 podcast downloads, and I was thinking, you know, wouldn't it be great to hit 50,000 downloads or 100,000 downloads? You know, I guess that's just the way at one level I'm wired, and it's okay for me to recognize that. But it does make me ask the question, how much of my desire to have our church, for example, make an impact on our community was mixed with me wanting to be seen by others and my peers as a pastoral player, a mover and a shaker? Probably more than I care to admit. It's always been hard for me to separate out ambition from selfish ambition. Is there even such a thing as godly ambition? I'm not sure. I know that I have been given, and I don't think it's a bad thing, to be given a natural desire to succeed and make a difference. So what's been more helpful for me is to really nail down my definition of success and start there. Now, I know if you ask most pastors, what does it mean to be a successful pastor? We would all, of course, perhaps secretly think, well, that means to pastor a successful church. And of course, by implication, that of course means a growing church, right? Why do you think so many pastors, for example, felt that the rug had been pulled out from them when COVID hit? Well, it's because all of their metrics of success were shattered. The rug was pulled out for them. And how many churches, even months after COVID, are not back to the same metrics of success they had before? And I get that at some level. You know, I like to think that when my Cowboys win, I win. You know, I haven't won a Super Bowl since 1995. Now, if I was a Viking fan or a Buffalo Bill fan, you know, that would be pretty good. But you know, I'm really down in the dumps of that. When the Cowboys would have a Super Bowl parade, it was my parade. I mean, it's like I am invited up on that float to celebrate with the players, because when my church is winning, when my football team is winning, it gives me a vicarious sense of success. And I know there's lots of people in our community who really need to be in a successful church. It's like they're vicarious. I'm successful because I go to the happening church in town. that's my well-being to be at this church. Their success is my success, just like my football team, right? So, there's all sorts of mixed up metrics of success. And the problem with that is that success comes and goes, like we saw, for example, with this whole season of COVID. It's often outside of my ability to control. And if I'm tied to those metrics of success, then I'm going to live out of a roller coaster sense of well-being. And I know this is not a revolutionary idea, and I know I'm sure heard this before, but I have to believe, and I'm holding to the fact that real success is spelled faithfulness. That's it. Did I do what God called me to do to the best of my ability, with my brokenness, with my gifts, with my limitations? And am I going to hear at the end of the day, well done, good and faithful servant? Any other metrics of success leads us in the dumps. Well done, good and faithful servant. And oftentimes that simply means showing up and continuing down on the road to which He has called you. Now, I know there's pastors like this, but I was never the sort of pastor that considered resigning every few months, right? And now I know there were, but that never really was my kind of jam. But I know that there was 2 or 3 times when I strongly considered quitting. I remember one of those times, and God needed to hit me between the eyes with this exhortation out of Matthew 24. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Okay, God, I hear you. It would be a good thing for me to be feeding your servants, because I've been, it would be a good thing for me to be doing what you called me to do, as opposed to not a good thing. And oftentimes it's a little bit like those signs on the highway. If you don't know the speed limit, the last speed limit is still in effect. And so keep doing it. Stay engaged, stay growing and standing despite how hard it is. Kind of reminds me of that verse in Ephesians. After all you have done everything, to stand. That is faithfulness. And I think that's the best metric of our success. Or this verse from James. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. Okay, God, I will obey. I may not do this well or successfully according to some, but I will continue to obey the call that you put on my life. So, in conclusion, let me answer the one question that I started with. Did I give the best years of my life to being a pastor? Or were my pastoral years the best years of my life? I think there's some mixed in that, but let me say this. I never regret my life as a pastor. I would do it all over again. I would make the same foundational choices again. Even if I can't import my 30 years of experience back in time to when I was 30. It was a privilege to be a pastor. I am a better person for it. I have grown through it, and I feel that throughout the way and even today, I've experienced the Father's pleasure. I hope as a pastor you continue to experience the same in your life. God bless.